This episode and others like it are made possible by the generous support of my patrons on Patreon. If you'd like to help me make more political content, consider becoming a patron at patreon.com/secondthought. Some viewers may find the following content disturbing. Viewer discretion advised.
I think America must see that riots do not develop out of thin air. Certain conditions continue to exist in our society, which must be condemned as vigorously as we condemn riots. In the final analysis, a riot is the language of the unheard. What is it that America has failed to hear? It has failed to hear that the plight of the Negro poor has worsened over the last few years. It has failed to hear that the promises of freedom and justice have not been met. And it has failed to hear that large segments of white society are more concerned about tranquility and the status quo than about justice, equality, and humanity. And so in a real sense, our nation's summers of riots are caused by our nation's winters of delay. And as long as America postpones justice, we stand in the position of having these recurrences of violence and riots over and over again. Social justice and progress are the absolute guarantors of riot prevention.
On May 25, 2020, a 46-year-old black man named George Floyd was murdered by the Minneapolis police. Floyd had recently lost his job as a result of the Minnesota stay-at-home order, and was accused of using a counterfeit $20 bill at a grocery store. In response, the police handcuffed him, pinned him to the ground, and Officer Derek Chauvin knelt on Floyd's neck for 8 minutes and 46 seconds. During that time, Floyd pleaded for them to stop. He said he couldn't breathe, that he was in pain. He called out for his mother. We can see one of the officers, Lane, check Floyd's pulse sometime after he's become unresponsive. According to the complaint against Derek Chauvin, Lane asked him twice whether they should roll Floyd onto his side. Both times, Chauvin said no, and kept pressing his knee into the man's neck, a move banned by most police departments. Even after an ambulance arrives and the medic checks Floyd's pulse again, Chauvin stays where he is. It's only when the EMTs tell him to get off that he finally does so, after almost 9 minutes. Floyd is pronounced dead at a nearby hospital shortly after. 4 days later, on May 29th, Chauvin is charged with manslaughter and third-degree murder. As of writing the script for this video, on June 1st, 2020, the 3 other officers involved have yet to be charged. But what had to happen in those 4 days between the murder of George Floyd and the charges against Chauvin, and what has happened since, is what really matters. In this video, we're going to take a good hard look at the state of police brutality and systemic racism in the United States. Before we begin, let me just say by the time this video is uploaded, things will have changed. The past 6 days have been incredibly tumultuous, and no one has been able to predict what will happen next. I will explain the situation to the best of my ability based on the material I have available as of June 1st, 2020. Let's get some background details out of the way first. In the aftermath of George Floyd's murder, the site of his arrest was turned into a memorial through May 26th. From there, a crowd began to gather, growing to hundreds of people and eventually marching to the Minneapolis Police's 3rd Precinct, where Chauvin and the others were stationed. Since that day, protests against police brutality have erupted all over the United States, in over 100 cities, as well as in places like England, Germany, and New Zealand. As police took to the streets in riot gear to disperse the protesters, more people became involved. And as millions around the country watched footage of cops lobbing tear gas into crowds, shooting protesters with rubber bullets, even brutalizing and arresting the reporters covering the events, support for the protests grew. Eventually, in what should be considered an historic event, protesters managed to capture and burn the 3rd Precinct on May 28th. Predictably, as the protests grew, we began to hear the usual voices condemning them.
Yet, as we've seen time and again, what began as peaceful protesting ended up in a very counterproductive and even criminal place.
But we cannot allow the righteous cries of peaceful protesters to be drowned out by an angry mob.
A weekend of unrest amid calls for change and a plea for peace.
Here's the thing. For these people, there's no right way for people of color to protest. The ones saying destruction of property makes them look bad are the same ones who called Colin Kaepernick a traitor and a son of a bitch for kneeling quietly during the anthem. If they're quiet, they're disrespectful and should just work harder. If they're loud, they're hurting their own image. If the protests are widespread and organic, they're incapable of organizing. If they're organized and set clear demands, they're led by outside agitators. There will never be a protest of any sort that is acceptable for those in power and those who benefit from the status quo. Any real expression of anger will be smeared and condemned. What happens when quiet, respectful protests are ignored? This is what happens. Patience runs out. Frankly, it's remarkable the restraint the black community has shown over the years. Decades of asking, "Please stop killing us," fell on deaf ears. And now the police are facing the righteous anger of the entire country, and even huge crowds in other countries. The people condemning riots are quick to quote Martin Luther King, but their version is a whitewashed shell of what Dr. King really stood for. Let's take a quick look at the civil rights movement. After Rosa Parks was arrested for refusing to give up her seat to a white person, the NAACP chose King to lead the Montgomery bus boycott, with the goal of desegregating public transportation. King quickly became the face of the civil rights movement, advocating civil disobedience and nonviolent protest. He led marches for freedom and equality, gave brilliant speeches, and was a voice for those who had long been considered second-class citizens. For his actions, he was jailed over 20 times, stabbed, his house was bombed, he faced constant death threats from white supremacists, and even received a letter from the FBI suggesting he should kill himself or they would release supposedly incriminating tapes of him. But King was undeterred. Between 1957 and 1968, he traveled over 6 million miles, led countless protests, and delivered over 2,000 speeches for the cause of equality. The people today who invoke the name of Martin Luther King for his nonviolence choose to disregard one critical aspect of the civil rights movement. The peaceful protesters were brutalized by the police. For the crime of wanting to be considered a human being, police viciously attacked King and his fellow marchers. Again, King was undeterred. He kept marching, kept protesting. Finally, after intense pressure from the black community and their allies, President Lyndon Johnson signed the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Act of 1965. But the signing of these acts did not erase America's hatred towards the black community.
Good evening. The Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King, 39 years old and a Nobel Peace Prize winner, and the leader of the nonviolent civil rights movement in the United States, was assassinated in Memphis tonight. A sniper's bullet cut down Dr. King as he stood on a hotel balcony in Memphis.
The assassin was later apprehended, and it's likely that he had been working with the FBI. We may never know for certain, but it definitely aligns with their previous threats. When Martin Luther King died, he had a 75% disapproval rating in the United States. It was only after his death that the white people of America could rewrite his story and make him a figurehead for obedience, taking his practice of nonviolence and twisting it to mean never organizing against your oppressors. They paint him as a docile man who only said nice things that everyone agreed with, and they choose to leave out the fact that he was an outspoken opponent of capitalism, American hypocrisy, poverty, militarism, and racism. But let's talk about nonviolence for a minute. Critics of the recent riots have said that the protesters are violent, that looting a Target is violent, that burning an Arby's is violent. Destruction of inanimate buildings is not violence. Killing people is violence. Assaulting protesters and driving police cruisers into crowds is violence. The protesters haven't killed anyone. You'd be hard-pressed to find evidence of a protester even taking a swing at a cop. In some instances, they've even protected police officers who got separated from their pack. Nonviolence is a tactic. If, for example, the crowds were to destroy, say, Sabre security equipment, which manufactures pepper spray for the police and is located at 747 Sun Park Drive in Fenton, Missouri, that would be furthering the cause of nonviolence, because they're removing part of the means by which violence is done to the people. Those decrying violence aren't concerned with police brutality, but expect you to shed a tear over looting a Target. As a totally unrelated side note, the largest source of theft by far is wage theft by corporations, to the tune of $40 billion a year, stolen from workers in the form of overtime violations, minimum wage violations, and rest break and off-the-clock violations. So excuse me if I don't care that people are taking back a little of what they're owed. But now we get to the real heart of the matter. And again, I want to warn viewers that you may find this content disturbing. We need to talk about police brutality, militarization, and white supremacy. Since the beginning of the uprising, the cops have shown us exactly who they are. Riot gear, tasers, tear gas, pepper spray, vicious beatings, slashing of tires, rubber bullets, armored trucks. The police, in response to a protest against police brutality, decided to act even more brutally towards the people they're supposed to protect and serve. But what's even more disgusting than their actions among the crowds is how they choose to act when they think no one is looking. Cops wearing plainclothes or disguises, some even in their full riot gear, have been breaking windows, leaving piles of bricks lying around, and parking cruisers in high-traffic areas with firearms inside. All of these actions are to try to incite the crowds to become violent, and thereby give the police more justification in killing people. The really disheartening thing is when you begin to realize that the police are enjoying this. They've been caught on camera laughing about violently assaulting people. One was caught throwing up a white power sign. This is all pretty damning, but there will still be people who say it's just a few bad apples. The funny thing is that no one seems to remember the rest of that expression. One bad apple spoils the bunch. That holds especially true with people in a position of power. If you have 1,000 good cops and 10 bad cops, and the 1,000 good cops don't turn in the 10 bad ones, you have 1,010 bad cops. But the thing is, the police haven't given us any evidence that there are any good cops at all. Over the last few days, pictures have begun to circulate of cops taking a knee near protesters. This has garnered them some support. But in every case, either immediately before or after, the cops assaulted or pepper sprayed the protesters. This is called copaganda. It's a PR stunt. If they really cared, they would have taken a knee years ago, or at least in the immediate aftermath of Floyd's murder. But they didn't. Instead, they pretend to care and then viciously attack everyone in the area. Luckily, even though the police are turning off their body cams, there are plenty of video cameras at the protests. The police can't fake their way out of their inexcusable behavior. Speaking of video cameras, let's talk about how the police have treated the press during the uprising.
Absolutely, guys. We've just had to run about a block as police moved in. We've been fired at with rubber bullets. My cameraman has been hit. We've also seen tear gas being used. Here we go. They're moving through again. This is exactly what it looks like. Exactly what it looks like. We're just staying safely.
Oh.
Whoa. Oh.
Amelia, can you hear us?
Amelia, are you okay?
Yes, I am. I am. You heard us yelling there that we were media, but they don't care. They are being indiscriminate at the moment. They chased us down that street, and as you see, they were firing these rubber bullets at everyone. There is tear gas, and now we are really surrounded by the police, and you really saw the way that they dealt with my cameraman, Tim. They're quite violent, and they do not care who they're targeting at the moment.
Prime Minister Scott Morrison has taken action after a 7 News crew was assaulted by US police during protests in Washington, D.C. this morning. Reporter Amelia Brace and her cameraman were attacked during a live on-air report.
We are live on the air at the moment. This is the four of us. We are one team. I'm sorry?
You're under arrest.
Okay. Do you mind telling me why I'm under arrest, sir? Why am I under arrest, sir?
As you've probably already seen on the news, it's hideous. Reporters from many different outlets have been assaulted, their gear destroyed, and some have even been arrested while live on the air. There is no possible way the police didn't realize they're the press. They have giant lights, tripods, and cameras, not to mention microphones and press badges. The fact that everyone from Fox News to CNN to countless independent outlets have been attacked should show you this isn't a partisan issue, it's a police state issue. The cops don't want their actions to be broadcast, and they'll go to ridiculous, counterproductive ends to try to keep it from happening, including arresting reporters while their cameras are rolling. There's a thread on Twitter that's currently over 90 tweets long documenting instances of police brutality against the press specifically, and it's shocking. Pushed over, shot with rubber bullets, beaten with batons, gassed, even pepper sprayed while displaying their press credentials. There is no excuse, none, for the police to deny the press their rights to cover events as they unfold, and certainly not to violently assault them while they try to do their jobs. A free press is essential to a healthy democracy, and what we're seeing should be a wake-up call.
Press! Press! I'm press! I am press. Okay, I'm down. I'm down. Okay. I am press. Please.
But the police aren't the only ones attempting to maim or kill protesters. White supremacists armed with guns have started to show up and threaten protesters. Surely they're being arrested, right? This man had his rifle pointed at demonstrators, and all he got was a quiet chat with a cop who sent him on his way. Unarmed protesters get beaten, armed white supremacists get to walk away after threatening to kill people. I don't think it's a stretch to say that maybe there's a connection when cops throw up white power signs and white vigilantes get a friendly talk instead of being tased and arrested.
Protecting the neighborhood, and yes, I have an AR-15 on me. How badass is this? This is never ever gonna happen again, guys. Never. This is so cool. Thanks, guys. Thank you.
In Detroit on May 30th, an SUV pulled up to a crowd and someone inside opened fire on protesters, killing a 19-year-old before fleeing the scene. They have not been apprehended. Another man, 22-year-old James Scurlock, was murdered by a white supremacist business owner who'd been yelling racial slurs at protesters all night. He shot Scurlock twice in the neck. The city of Omaha announced they will not bring charges against him. These killers are the same people who will yell "All Lives Matter" at people of color marching for justice. It would be easy for me to say that the slogan "All Lives Matter" is a racist dog whistle and leave it at that, because, well... But I want to believe there are people out there who aren't violent racists and truly don't understand, so I'll try something else. Imagine you've taken your beautiful family to the beach. Caden, Braden, and Bree Deansley are happy building a sandcastle, but Broccoli is drowning out in the water. If your response is to shake your head at Broccoli and say, "All lives matter," that makes you a bad parent. Now apply that line of thought to what we're seeing today. People of color are killed by the police at a much higher rate than other groups. If the phrase "Black Lives Matter" bothers you, please consider why you feel that way. Perpetrators aside, we need to take a look at the weapons the police are using to assault protesters. Let's start with tear gas. Tear gas is a chemical weapon that causes temporary blindness, severe eye and respiratory pain, skin irritation, and bleeding. If you heard the words chemical weapon and thought, wait, aren't those banned? Yes, they are. In war. But apparently it's perfectly acceptable to use them on your own citizens. You'd think such an extreme option would be saved as a last resort, but we've seen cops use it as the first offensive against protesters in recent days. Rubber bullets are one of the most common ways the police have been harming protesters. Okay, but it's rubber, right? How bad can it be? Well, judging by the fact that they're considered a less lethal round instead of a non-lethal round, and you're supposed to fire them at the ground to bounce them at your target, not fire at people directly, that should give you a pretty good idea. These things can and do kill. And, surprise, surprise, cops have been firing them directly at people. At least one person has been permanently blinded in one eye after being hit in the face with a rubber bullet. At best, these things hurt like hell and leave a nasty bruise. At worst, they can tear a chunk out of your face, blind you, or even kill you on the spot. Then, of course, there are tasers, batons, flashbang grenades, horses apparently, car doors, and the whole damn vehicle. But the most dangerous tool in the police arsenal is the officer himself. The police have shown that they have exactly zero restraint. They've kicked people while they're down and blinded, slashed tires, tased the passengers, and dragged them out of the car. They've maced people who were cooperating, shoved one woman to the ground so hard she had a seizure, pushed over an old man walking with a cane, and launched full-out assaults on peacefully assembled citizens. Yes, the police need to be demilitarized. There's a clear connection between the money spent on military-grade equipment and violence against citizens. But demilitarization alone won't solve the problem. The police are the problem. They're never held accountable without massive pressure from the people, and even then they often get released on bail or just assigned to a new station a couple towns over. Our politicians have been silent at best, or actively encouraging of racist violence in the case of the president and some other extremists in government. The presumptive Democratic nominee has said, maybe we can shoot them in the leg instead. What kind of a solution is that? The deadly combination of military police and white supremacy has rotted the police apparatus to the core. When armed white protesters can show up to a government building, threaten the lawmakers, and no one gets arrested, tased, or beaten, but black people are murdered for doing nothing at all, you cannot reach any conclusion other than that there are two Americas. One for the white people and those in power, and one for everyone else. When cops are throwing up white power signs and laughing about brutalizing the people they're supposed to protect and serve, you have to realize that the system is broken. We've already seen deaths in this uprising. White supremacist murderers have killed people or attempted to do so, on camera, and they walk away. The protesters have not killed anyone. We have to reject the mainstream media's framing of the uprising. The protesters are not the violent ones. The police are. They instigate the confrontations every time. They arrest and assault journalists. They drive cars into crowds of people, for God's sake. What the media won't show you is the scenes of peaceful protest, the kind they claim to want. Scenes of solidarity and joy in the face of oppression and tragedy. Protesters dancing together, cooking meals for those in need, offering medical attention to their neighbors injured by the police. On multiple occasions, the police have rolled up and destroyed these supply stations, even firing rubber bullets at medics taking care of the injured.
And I was helping a man who got shot in the leg with a rubber bullet. He was bleeding so much.
You saw this?
I was helping him. I was cutting his pants. I was trying to help him. I was trying to look at the wound, and they came up and they were shooting right at us. He grabbed a garbage can to hold it over me so I wouldn't get hurt. And I told them I wouldn't leave him, and I did, and I feel so bad. I couldn't. They were shooting. I was scared. They didn't care. They didn't care that he was hurt.
But the people have not been deterred. They come back, reorganize, and fight to defend their communities and demand a better life for their children. Lawyers have offered to represent those arrested in the protests for free. Mutual aid and bail funds are being flooded with donations from all over the country. People are bringing food, water, and medical supplies to sustain the protesters. If you'd like to help, there will be links in the description for funds to contribute to. We should be ashamed and infuriated that our country has chosen to violently suppress its own people rather than hold the police accountable for their actions. And it's not over yet. This will get worse. Now that the National Guard has been called into several states and are armed with live ammunition, I can only pray that by the time this video goes live, the state will not have murdered crowds of civilians. The police are in the wrong. They are the problem. To the protesters standing up against centuries of injustice, the eyes of the world are upon you. You have the support of people from all walks of life, of all colors and creeds, from countries around the world and right here at home. There will be opposition from those who benefit from the status quo, but you have the right to have a say in your future, and we're proud of you for standing against systemic racism and police brutality. We stand in solidarity with your efforts and join you in the hope that one day soon we can build a better world. If you enjoyed this video and you'd like to see more like it, consider subscribing to stay up to date with my latest episodes. If you hated it, go ahead and drop a thumbs down. And if you really want to help support my channel, I recently started a Patreon, which you can find at patreon.com/secondthought. You can check out my previous episodes by clicking the links on your screen. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next week.